This is a really important and practical session. It's quite a dry topic, but it's kind of the fundamental one. So this is where you're going to get the sort of the nuts and bolts of the different elements of starting with market interest, then investors, grants, producer offset, other sorts of finance and funding for your projects, and how it all fits together. So we have our illustrious panel. We have Veronica Fury, who's the executive producer at Wild Bear Entertainment, specialising particularly in factual television. Sharon Menzies, who's the managing director of Fulcrum Media Finance, and in that capacity is privy to pretty well every type of financing a project that there is. And Vincent Sheehan, who's producer and partner at Porchlight Films, who's worked across feature and more recently television drama. And so we're going to try and address doco, TV drama and feature. I've asked our speakers to each give a bit of a short case study, and then we'll have a Q&A. I'll ask a couple of questions and then there'll be plenty of time for you to ask questions. So you're next to me. May as well start with you, okay. Veronica.
Hello everyone. Can you all hear me? Today, as Lois said, we do a lot of factual television, and I've picked today a project that sort of suits a low budget factual project. It was a project that started off as a 1 hour pitch, but has then got turned into a feature doc. But I'll just concentrate on that first step of funding this film. The numbers, due to privacy reasons and my funding partners, are confidential, so they're not, the numbers you are seeing are not necessarily exactly replicant to this film, but they are very likely of the type of project that this would fund. So please don't hold these figures to this film in particular. The film's called Stranded, and I think, Ken, if we could just move to the trailer, I'll give you a bit of a teaser, so we'll get rid of have the fun first, and then we can talk about the numbers. Oh, that one. So here's the final sizzle for this film. Nice and loud, Ken. Well, maybe not too loud.
In the mid-1970s, Western democracy was groaning under the weight of an economic crisis. The US was in financial trouble, the UK was experiencing double-digit inflation, and Australia was in the grip of a crippling recession. Out of this chaos, a moment of global synchronicity took place. Punk music was born. Almost simultaneously and completely ignorant of each other, the Ramones were thrashing away in New York. The Sex Pistols were enraging the establishment in London, and in, of all places, Brisbane, one band was rewriting the music rulebook.
Say just like punk rock before punk rock. Plug into your amp, turn it up, and away you go.
Johnny Ramone said, "Have you ever heard the Saints? From Australia, they're just like us."
The Saints were a proper rock band. Turbo engines full on. Here we are. Here's our calling card.
Just thought, wow, that's pretty wild. There's a band that sounds like that and it's come out of Brisbane.
Governed by an ultra-conservative premier, backed by a corrupt police force, and with a population that had no desire for change, Queensland was the perfect breeding ground for a musical and cultural revolution.
If we lived in utopia, what would be the point of kicking against the pricks?
This is the story of Brisbane, and a group of 4 suburban boys who would unwittingly play a part in changing the world's musical landscape forever. The Saints. The evolution, the revolution, and the repercussions.
The whole music business needed a kick up the arse, and it got it.
Thank you. So that's the fun bit. But someone has to make it, and we have to put a finance plan together. So given that we've just got a short amount of time to talk through this, people that were in my last session before heard me talk through the development process. This went through a heavy lifting development process to get to production. But once we'd gone through that stage, we'd got an ABC commission, we'd picked up some partners. That's when we build a finance plan. So Ken, if we could just go to my finance plan.
Is that the one?
That's the one. Is it? Oh, it's not up, Ken, but that is the one. I hope it is. It could be my whole business plan for the year. I'll have to turn around and look at it. They all start to blend into one another. So Screen Australia has all the templates on it that Australians use for producing films sort of formally and through the Australian system on their website. So this is a producer equity program template. You don't have to build these things yourself. They do all the work for you. They add up all the bits and bobs. You just have to raise the money, punch the numbers in, and Bob's your uncle. Sounds easy, doesn't it? But you'll start to see there, again, this is not the actual pre-sale, but I just wanted to put something indicative in. We got an ABC pre-sale. They had an art slot where they wanted to explore Australian art stories that had global impact or related with the global market. And this project, as you can see from the final sizzle, tells that story nicely. So it fit the spot. We got commissioned. We got a distributor on this film, Umbrella Films. People may know Umbrella Films do feature-length documentaries and feature films. And in this particular instance, they came on board and supported us with a little bit of support to get the rights to distribute this film. We got a state funding body, you'll see further down, Screen Queensland. I live in Brisbane, and we'll go back to that a little bit further in a minute, but Screen Queensland came in. Screen Australia may or may not come into a project like that. You apply through the producer's door. And then then we've got Wild Bear Entertainment. We're a fairly big company now. We often invest in our own shows. We invest our time. We invest some resources. So that makes up a part of the finance plan as an equity investment. And I think there's some reasons why we do that we can talk about later. And then you'll see that there's a PEP, Producer Equity Program Payment, which makes up the rest for a budget of $495,500. Now the PEP program in Australia is capped at $500,000. So usually for me it's a $500,000 budget. I'll do whatever it takes to sit at that. And can we go to the Screen Australia site, Ken, to have a look at the product? This program has a fairly new program for Screen Australia. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Screen Australia. Are people familiar with the Screen Australia PEP program? Can I have a show of hands at who's familiar? So that's not heaps. So I thought, Ken, if we could sort of talk through, because you look at that page, I never know where to go in these days, but go into the menu and go into, oh my God, where do you go? Funding and support. This is like the mystery, find the way through. It's not the producer offset. I'm sure we're going to talk about that next.
Documentary?
Yep. And production. You can see there's lots of support there, everyone. Go in there and play for days. I look at this site every day of my life. And here's the Producer Equity Program. So all the information's there. Because this is a 5-minute sort of speed date through a finance plan, the guidelines are there, eligibility, all your templates, budget templates, what you need to do, how you qualify. There are hoops to jump through. You need to have a marketplace in position of a certain amount. But if all your buttons all the boxes are ticked, you qualify without competition. It's a qualifying fund that you qualify for up to $100,000, and that's an amazing support, and it gives you a chance to really leverage your film up to a higher value with some hard cash in the budget without too much paperwork involved. Once you go over that $500,000, we need to get the wonderful offset and work with Fulcrum and places like that to fund your finance. But this is a really simple process. I just wanted to say that it's also a project like this would be topped up with state money. Can we have a quick look at the Screen Queensland site? So for you guys, you've got the wonderful Screen New South Wales, or people who drift over the border like me, Screen Queensland. Can we go into production? Production funding. And then look at, you can see the same thing. There's all the guidelines, all the criteria, funding deadlines, all that sort of stuff. So when you're starting to put your finance plan together, you need to make sure that all your elements are, you're qualifying, you're meeting the guidelines, you're not missing, you could miss a date and not get your application in on time and have to wait another 3 or 4 months. You've got to just make sure you're across all your elements. It's paint by numbers, really. We've got wonderful support on a federal and state level in Australia, as you heard Graham Mason say yesterday. And it's once you sort of know the pathways and you can put a finance plan together, these are the types of resources that you need to be tapping into. If we just go back to the finance plan. Sorry to Ken. Are people familiar with those sites and funding opportunities in those realms? Yeah, great. Yep. So now, after you've sort of seen those websites, and we look at this again, maybe from the top up, we've got Marketplace up the top. You've got your Marketplace, you've got your grants, and the grants that come into the project from those 2 agencies that we spoke about. We've got an equity investor, that's us, an equity investor, and then down the bottom, the PEP, the Producer Equity Program funding that supports this project. It might be also important to mention that on the Screen Australia site, to apply for that other grant that was further up, that's a different section. How do we go to that? Producer Program. So there's any amount up to $750 may be applied for. So there's, again, they run down application deadlines, decisions, and there's inquiries, downloads, eligibility. There's all, it's really, even at an early stage, so many projects go through these programs that it's worth really knowing how the financial system works for these types of documentaries in Australia. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to come back and unpack some of these different types of money a bit later, but we might now go to Vincent. Vincent, did you have a hypothetical or a sort of, what did you call it, a hybrid case study?
Yeah. It'll come up in a second. Look, this is just a very basic feature film finance plan. There it is. Yep, and I adapted this from something, and in doing so, I changed a lot of the figures around, not necessarily to disguise the film, but to actually kind of bring it a bit more in line with Screen Australia and where they're at the moment. So it's a very basic finance plan, and you're talking further about feature films as well. So I'll leave a few things for Sharon to cover. And I look in, there's Marketplace and there's investors. The investors are purchasing a share of copyright ownership in the project. The Marketplace are purchasing a license fee to distribute it. So that's the kind of the basic. And starting from the top is kind of what is the order that you do things. And it was funny when I was doing this, I kind of went, this is how you do it. And the Australian distributor is a fundamental thing that you need to have in place if you're financing a film with the offset in mind as part of your finance plan. And let's face it, most people are doing that. You need to have a budget of more than $500,000 of qualifying expenditure in order to trigger the 40% producer offset. This is a budget of 6 million. Nice and neat 6 million. So the reason that we have this distributor at the top is that one of the criteria for qualifying is that you have to have a theatrical release. So and that is still a criteria. There's been a myriad of borderline exhibition of feature films to qualify, from Fall Walling, where they actually just rent the cinema themselves.
Just not allowed.
It's not allowed, but it is technically not allowed. But as long as you can have, I think it's 6 screens. 6 screen release is the minimum. I think there's people have done 6 screen releases and qualified. But the intention of a theatrical release is the most important thing. So at the stage of financing, if a distributor puts up a certain amount of money at a certain level and their intention is to theatrically release it, then they most likely will qualify, even if it's a very minimal release in the end. And that's my point. Not so much that there's loopholes, but so that's kind of a critical thing. There's a figure up there that's $275,000 is the advance against all Australian rights. And I think one of the things that you need to do when you're financing a film is understand the value of the rights within your project. And we just touched on this right at the end of the last program. Does anyone know what I kind of mean by that? Let's have an engagement with the audience. Yes. Do you tell me? No. You just know. Okay.
Well, from me, I've had stuff options, so I've had to go into rights in that way.
Yes. Okay. Well, look. The thing is, if you have a particular project, it's a story, it's a script. There's cast, there's directors, there's a genre. All of them will give you information about where its value is. Is it absolutely a theatrical release film? And distributors will be looking at every project and saying, how am I going to make my money back? What is the most money I will put into this film where I'm not going to lose? And that's a fundamental. They will not be saying, they are doing the numbers, as they say. And they'll often tell you, let me do some numbers and I'll get back to you. But most of them are doing it in their head. It's what they do every day. So they're just running the numbers, which is like, we can achieve this theatrically, we can achieve this much through DVD. I think we'll get this much back from digital these days, and there's a myriad of options of exploiting digital rights. It's huge educational value, so I'll put a little bit more into screen rights, and I'll perhaps fight harder for a split on screen rights. So all of those things have a value and have a commission that they'll put to those things as well. So they'll all add up to something that they'll say, I'm prepared to give you this much money knowing that I will get that back. And that's what they're saying. So you can often work out what they estimate, the value is by the numbers they put forward. But you need to have a good idea of that first, because you want to go in there knowing what your budget level is and that you need to achieve this kind of figure. Now, what may happen with something like this is I've got like a $500,000 advance from a sales agent and a couple of pre-sales in there as well from some territories. So in this instance, it has a lot of value in the foreign market, more so than the domestic. It may have some cast attached that's meaningful in the UK or Europe, or have a certain kind of genre. It could be a horror with some cast attached. Less value in the domestic market, much more meaningful in the foreign market. So all of those things, understanding where those values sits, allows you to kind of position the film. And then once you have those two things in place, you then can move through the other things. I've got quite a large state agency figure in here. So this is being shot entirely in South Australia or Western Australia because they have substantial funding for, and you would be having a Western Australia producing partner on this project if that's the case, or you just would have moved there. And then state agency. So you're doing the shoot there, but you're actually posting back in the home state, so you can get some money for your state from the state that you're doing the posting. The offset there is calculated 40% of the, I didn't have that figure up there, but it was about 5.5 million as qualifying expenditure. So when you do a budget, you have the qualifying expenditure, and there's things that don't qualify, financing costs essentially now. There used to be a lot more, but they kind of streamlined it about 4 or 5 years ago to just make it a number of things that don't qualify. And there's certain shooting overseas and having companies that are not Australian pay for services and things that don't qualify. The producer offset is about a 40% on the qualifying Australian expenditure. So it's just money expended in Australia. And so then there's always a gap. When is there never not a gap?
There's always a gap.
There's always a gap.
Yep.
So you don't quite have enough money to cover your budget. And so producer investment, that reinvesting fees, a few things like that. And you've got to be cautious about to what level you do this. And certainly Screen Australia they will scrutinise that as well.
Very scrutinised.
And a private investor. And I put a private investor there because with the producer offset and with Screen Australia, depending on who the private investor is, you can give them an accelerated recoupment position, and often it's good to be engaging with the private sector and putting them in a position where they can get their money back. So I put them in for a small amount. And you see in the recoupment, even though they're putting in 2.9%, they're getting an accelerated 11.67% recoupment and a little bit more profit than they normally would there. So that's the kind of basic feature film finance plan. Is that enough?
Yeah, no, that's great, because we'll come back and talk more. Is everyone completely? Is everyone with us?
You completely understood all those plans.
Do people understand the critical?
There was a question halfway through,
Okay.
which I kind of. Could we just take that one question?
Yeah,
just
sure.
because it was halfway through, and maybe it was.
We'll come back for plenty of questions after.
Okay,
Yeah,
we'll come
yeah.
back.
Yeah.
We'll come back.
Okay. Just the critical piece of information, though, is that basically, and for feature film, unless you've got a distributor already committed, or for television, unless you've got a broadcaster already committed formally, you cannot apply for any other funding. So, or investment. That's absolutely the first step. So unless you've got market interest formally, you can't go any further. So that's kind of step one.
That's a really good point. Yeah.
Sharon?
That market interest, just with the ANZ distributor, doesn't necessarily have to be in the form of a distribution guarantee. We've got plenty of projects that there's distributors attached, there's no distribution guarantee, but they will have a commitment to prints and advertising, and also screens, the minimum 6 screens in 3 major cities.
They will have a distribution agreement that actually has that in there that allows it to qualify, so that it gets the producer offset provisional certificate, which is the most important thing.
And when Screen Australia are looking at that, they will be looking at the ANZ distribution agreement, and then all the other elements of the film to make sure that it is actually theatrical, and that's sort of like how you contract your cast and sales agent and just the whole package, really.
Can I just jump in and mention that the 20% for television, though, there is a television offset as well that people might be familiar with, that's capped at 20%. We don't get the 40%, but 20%, where you don't need a theatrical release. It qualifies through the fact that it's going on to Australian audiences. So that's...
Do people understand how the producer offset works?
It's a big one, and that's what that's what we do here in Australia as a producer. That's what you do. Yeah.
Okay. And as well as the television producer offset, there's also the post and digital and visual effects, which is now 30%. So I don't want to confuse you, but if you have got those types of projects, then it is worth looking at, or animation projects, it is worth looking at, is it television or is it actually PDV? And they're slightly different, but the best thing to do is to look at the websites, because it's very clear when you're calculating your qualifying Australian production expenditure what the exclusions and the caps are.
I mean, Ken can show, if you go back onto that Screen Australia website, it's all there. Yeah. Oh, okay, sorry, Sharon, I thought we were in a more open thing. Sorry to jump in. Typical producer. Sorry, I didn't realise.
Right, so I've got a finance plan here. It is a feature film. The budget's just over 1.3 million, and this is a real example that happened a couple of years ago. So when it came, and I won't talk about the pitching or anything like that, because there's no anything creative in Fulcrum apart from some creative numbers going on. So when it first came into us, it was that top finance plan. So we've got Screen Australia putting in a grant money of $500,000, so that's their top amount. If you go over $500,000, then it becomes production investment. State agency putting in a grant of $120,000. A lovely private investor putting in $100,000. Producer reinvesting just under $30,000. So when you are in that situation and you are reinvesting, just make sure that you're taking tax advice, because tax invoices are issued and there are agreements, and you will be taxed on your full fee even though you're putting that back into the budget. So take tax advice, and especially on how that's structured for your particular company as well. The ANZ distributor came on board, and they were lucky enough to have a DG of distribution guarantee of $60,000, and there was a sales agent on board at the very beginning, and with a sales advance of $120,000. But that sales advance, and something that we see very common, was linked to cast. So when we started contracting, the cast hadn't been secured. So I'll show you what happened during contracting. Now this happens with the ANZ distributor. We often see this, is that when we start contracting, their distribution guarantee will be a certain amount, but there will be linkages to cast and also to ratings. And then there's the producer offset, which is calculated as 40% of the qualifying Australian production expenditure. And the best thing to do, as I said yesterday, go to the Screen Australia website. Fantastic resources that they've got there, in particular offset at a glance, and that's very clearly sets out what's included and what's not. So just looking at that finance plan, it's nice and easy. So coming out at the very back with revenue, the sales agent is always in front after the collection agent will take their fees, which are very minor. The sales agent would be in front for commission expenses and then recoupment of their $120,000. And then after that, there would be the equity participants, which are the private investor, the producer at 6%, and then the 76% that doesn't come back to Fulcrum because we obviously recoup from the producer offset, but that is producer equity, so that's going to the producer. So that's split 19% to the private investor, and then the balance to the producer. Then moving on to the second finance plan. So this is what happened during contracting. It was a long process. Nearly killed us.
They made budget.
Sorry?
They made budget.
Yeah, they did.
But they lost the grant.
They lost the grant, and they didn't secure the cast that they were going for, and so their sales agent dropped to $60,000. So what do? The fees in this particular film, I mean, it's only 1.3. The fees were so low, the overheads were so low that it just, the producers could not reinvest all of that amount. And you've got to be careful when you are reinvesting, because there was a completion guarantor on this project, that once you start investing a lot of your fees, then it interferes with what the completion guarantor could possibly hold back at the end. So it's a fine balance. So they went back to Screen Australia and asked for 50,000 more, but it tipped them over into production investment. And I mentioned yesterday in the roundtable, the contracting turned into a legal picnic, just because it is a lot more complicated. The state agency, again, still kept it there at their 120,000. They still had the private investor. The producer had to put in slightly more. They couldn't put in any more than that. ANZ distributor stayed at that level. They were fine with the casting, but obviously the sales agent dropped. So what that meant was that the in first position would be the sales agent for the 60,000 plus your fees and commissions and expenses. But then the equity participants, you've now got Screen Australia in there. So you've got Screen Australia at 50%, private investor, and then 41% going to the producer. So it's quite a dramatic shift in your potential earnings out the back.
Does that make sense? So if it's a grant, it becomes part of the producer's equity in the project, and then that increases the producer's percentage of returns at the back. Whereas if it's an investment from Screen Australia, then they take that percentage share of the returns. So that's what a grant is, what's known as soft money, and that becomes part of the producer's contribution, whereas an investor takes their cut off any of the returns, and how that works is determined in the contracts.
Can I just add, I mean, with the sales agent and linking to cast, it was a very unusual situation, and it was a project that was happening very fast, and that's why they didn't have their casting sort of locked down before we started contracting. But we see this often with the ANZ distributors, where they link to cast, or they are linked to a rating. And if you can't guarantee the rating, then they will actually reduce their distribution guarantee.
Do you mean
Can you
rating?
explain
that
what
it
you mean
swaps?
by a
Yeah.
rating? Yeah.
PG.
Yeah, the MA, yeah, PG. I think once it goes past a, is it the R?
Oh wow, yeah, geez.
Yeah, then they can't trailer it. So it actually impacts what they can, their marketing for the film.
Why did they decide to do it that way? Why did they, knowing that was going to affect things so much, why did they go to the execution grant for the Screen Australia?
They were, at this stage, they were 3 weeks into shooting.
And they had a gap in their finance plan. Yeah.